El paro cardíaco fuera del hospital es un tema grave de salud y es un reto para los profesionales prehospitalarios. En México no tenemos datos de cuántas personas caen en paro cardíaco fuera del hospital y mucho menos sabemos cuántos de ellos sobreviven. No tenemos simplemente esa información. Nadie la recopila, nadie la analiza, nadie la publica y mientras las cosas sean así no podremos saber. Sin embargo, hay gente que dice que nunca se le ha muerto a nadie en la ambulancia. Hay gente que dice que todos sus pacientes llegan con pulso al hospital y si se muere es por culpa de la sala de urgencias. Ojo, cualquiera que les diga que su índice de sobrevida en la ambulancia aquí en México es del 50, del 60, del 70%, véanlo firmemente a los ojos y pregúntenle, ¿vives en Seattle? Seattle es la ciudad en los Estados Unidos que tiene mayor índice de sobrevida. Sus números están alrededor del 60% y me atrevo a decir que en el mundo 60%, y ese 60% no lo logra solo el sistema de emergencias, no lo logra una ambulancia a la vez. Eso lo logra un servicio completo integrado con una comunidad que está educada y que sabe qué hacer. Mientras en México nuestra comunidad no esté lista para eso, el sistema de emergencias va a seguir con un pequeño problema para elevar esos números. Tengo aquí a mi lado una persona que no vive en Seattle, él vive en South Carolina, pero el índice de sobrevida en su lugar de trabajo es del 42% en los últimos 5 años. 42% es grande. Ellos recibieron un premio hace unos años, ya les va a contar de eso, porque llegaron hasta la barrera de los 70%. ¿Sí? Él es paramédico certificado en los Estados Unidos desde hace más de 20 años, es capitán de bomberos en Hilton Head Island, South Carolina, y es jefe del programa de Cardiac Care en su área. Quiere decir que todo lo que pasa en RCP, en las 7 estaciones de bomberos en Hilton Head, pasa porque él lo hizo. Él lo hizo, él lo supervisa y él lo sigue mejorando día con día. Y lo mejor de todo es que también hace unas semanas estuvo en Seattle y sigue aprendiendo y sigue mejorando lo que ha hecho. Entonces, no me queda más que tener el honor de presentar y dejar con ustedes a Tom Bouthillette y espero que en 1 o 2 años pueda regresar y decirnos qué sucedió con los cambios que va a estar realizando a partir de que regrese a su trabajo. Un aplauso, por favor.
Buenos tardes. So I'll be giving my talk in English. For anyone who doesn't speak English, it'd be a good idea, I guess, to put on the headphones for the translations. We will get to, both together? Okay. So initially this talk was going to be completely about ventilation strategies for sudden cardiac arrest. And so in particular, so-called hands-only CPR, or in the United States, we refer to it sometimes as cardiocerebral resuscitation because the emphasis on continuous chest compressions is really meant to perfuse the brain. So when we do a resuscitation, yes, we're trying to reanimate the heart, but it's really a brain resuscitation too. If we don't bring a patient back that has a fully intact brain, then we're not really restoring them back to their family and their full level of functioning, and of course that's our goal. But last night at the instructor's dinner, I had so many questions about my EMS system, and people are very curious to know how we have achieved the results that we have achieved on Hilton Head Island, where I live, to improve cardiac arrest survival. So last night I revamped the presentation a little bit to kind of give an overview of the community where I live and some of the steps that we've taken to improve cardiac arrest survival over the past 5.5 years or so. So this is where I live. Hilton Head Island is a barrier island off the southeastern United States. It's a very beautiful place, much like Mexico. So we have lots of things like dolphin and alligators and baby sea turtles. So we're a major tourist destination. And so when people come to Hilton Head Island, they're usually interested in golf or tennis, but we also have 13 miles of beaches. So although our year-round population, according to census data, is only 38,000, our peak summertime population can be as high as 275,000, which of course pales in comparison to the 9 million who live in Mexico City. Oops. This is a picture of my fire station number 6. I'm assigned to ladder 6, which is the truck there in the middle, but as you can see on the left side of this picture, we also have a advanced life support ambulance. All 7 of our fire stations have at least a fire engine and an ambulance on Hilton Head Island. So we have 54 square miles roughly, and we see 2.4 million visitors a year. So how did we on Hilton Head Island, in a relatively short period of time, going from saving almost no one who had suffered a cardiac arrest in our community to becoming nationally recognized in 2012 as a heart-safe community by the International Association of Fire Chiefs? It all started when we recognized the need for change, and the way this happened was a series written by a paramedic turned journalist named Bob Davis, who wrote a series in our national newspaper in the United States, which is called the USA Today. In 2005, Bob Davis wrote a series called 6 Minutes to Live or Die. And it's a very important series. It's still available on the World Wide Web today, but basically what Bob did is travel around the entire United States and visit all the major cities, and he found something out very interesting, in that there was tremendous variability in your odds of survival depending on what city you lived in the United States. And as a matter of fact, in the entire country, there were only about 12 major cities in the US that had any idea how many patients lived or died when they had suffered cardiac arrest. Because what basically happens with EMS, and I'm sure it sometimes happens also here in Mexico, we play our role. We take care of a critical patient. We do our best to stabilize them. We take them to the hospital, and we transfer care over to the nurses and physicians, and then we go back and we run another call. It's not obvious to us what happened, what the patient's clinical trajectory was after we left, and specifically in the case of sudden cardiac arrest, we may know that the patient had a pulse back when we drop them off in the emergency department, but we really have no idea whether or not they lived or died. And this was perceived by almost everyone in the emergency medical services in the United States as a significant problem. So partially in response to this, the CDC and Emory University in Atlanta created a registry called the Cardiac Arrest Registry to enhance survival. So this is a very powerful database, and you partner with your receiving hospitals. So now we start to benchmark these things, we start entering data. It gives information like the patient's age and gender and the location of the cardiac arrest, but for the first time ever, we were able to answer questions like, well, how often does sudden cardiac arrest happen in our jurisdiction? Are people performing bystander CPR? How often is an AED deployed? How frequently do we find them in a so-called shockable rhythm? So with VFib or VTAC, which are thought to have a better prognosis. We really didn't know. We estimated it. You can estimate it in your own community too, because we know in most communities about 1 out of every 1,500 people of your general population will suffer an out-of-hospital cardiac arrest in the next year. So we guesstimated our year-round population because of our surge of tourists at about 75,000. You divide 1,500 into that, and it comes out to about 50, and it ends up we see about 50 a year. We figured about half of those would be witnessed by a bystander. Right off the bat, we know that 25 of them are irreversibly dead. It's a very time-sensitive emergency, and if no one witnesses the collapse and provides CPR, your odds of survival are essentially 0. So for the 5.5 years that we've been reporting data to the CARES registry, we have never saved an unwitnessed arrest. So our survival rate for them is 0. But now we're down to 25 that have been witnessed, and we thought maybe half of them again would be an initial shockable rhythm, and that turned out to be a pretty good estimate. So it is possible to estimate the epidemiology of sudden cardiac arrest in your community that way, and it turns out to be kind of helpful. But we have actual real data now that helps us make good decisions. So here's a map of all the communities in the United States that are part of the CARES registry. This map has changed a little bit. For example, where I live in South Carolina, you can see Hilton Head has a circle around it. Well, now the entire state has a CARES coordinator, and we're going to try to start collecting data from the entire state. So I just wanted everyone to understand that just because we have this capability of tracking data in the United States, it is still very much a minority of EMS systems in the United States that are tracking data. This is still a tremendous problem because how do you improve something that you don't measure? It's very, very difficult to prove that you're really helping if you're not tracking these outcomes in this data. So, for the first time ever, after this series from Bob Davis's 6 Minutes to Live or Die, and we decided we were going to join the CARES registry. As you can imagine, my chief at the fire department was a little bit concerned what the data was going to show, right? If you don't track anything at all, no one can say you're poorly performing. So it's kind of a leap of faith into transparency to say, we're going to start to measure. Someone's going to hold this mirror up to your organization, and you might find out that you're not performing well at all. That could be politically embarrassing, who knows? So we decided that it was such an important step to try and improve survival that we had to do it. It was our obligation to try and do it, even if initially the results were a little bit embarrassing. But it also really motivated us to get better and to change. So once we started reporting data to the CARES registry, we started contacting all of the top EMS systems in the United States that we knew were performing well with sudden cardiac arrest, and we asked them, how are you doing it? And it turns out they were delighted to have conversations with us and explain exactly what we would have to do to make it happen in our own community. So we assembled a multidisciplinary team, and we met them up at our receiving hospital. This was the first time in our community's history that EMTs and paramedics sat down at the same table with nurses, emergency physicians, and cardiologists and pharmacists, and all the different stakeholders involved in saving a patient's life from sudden cardiac arrest. In hindsight, if I had to do it over again, there's only one group that was missing. We didn't have a patient advocate there. I think if I had to do it over again, I'd have someone there advocating for the patient themselves. But at that point, we might not even have been able to find a cardiac arrest survivor. It was very, very unusual that we would save someone's life at that point. One of the things that we found, for example, is a lot of times we worked cardiac arrest on the way to the hospital in the back of a bumpy ambulance. And we know now that CPR quality really suffers when you do that. That's one of the best practices we found out when we called around to the top performing systems, and that's one of the very first things that we changed. So we really poured over the 2010 guidelines, because that's when this was 2010, and we distilled it down and we decided what the 2010 AHA ECC guidelines were trying to tell us is that we should have minimally interrupted chest compressions. Chest compressions were very important. Number two, we wanted to control ventilations. And there's reasons that ventilations need control. We can squeeze the bag too often. We can squeeze the bag with too much volume. Both of those things are bad. As we give positive pressure breaths, it increases intrathoracic pressure, and when it increases intrathoracic pressure, it reduces blood return to the heart. So you can actually lower the patient's blood pressure by hyperventilating. So hyperventilating is very bad. So the 2010 guidelines wanted us to stop doing that. And just to show how difficult that is, because it's been studied, even after training, paramedics, nurses, physicians, everyone, even after explicit training to slow down with the bag valve mask, they still squeeze the bag too much. For example, if you wanted to squeeze the bag once every 6 seconds, it's kind of strange when you see how slow that actually is. Squeeze 1,002, 1,003, 1,004, 1,005, 1,006, 1,000, squeeze 1,002, 1,000. It's really slow. It's really slow. And to give a guidelines compliant breath, of 3 to 600 milliliters. It's a very small bag squeeze. It's a tiny little bag squeeze. So go out later to the Laerdal booth and get their instrumented mannequin and put the bag valve mask on the mannequin and give it a little bag squeeze and find out for yourself just how little you have to squeeze that bag to give the appropriate tidal volume during cardiac arrest. I'll bet you that it's less than you think it is, and that's the importance of instrumented mannequins. We also knew we wanted to shock on a 2-minute cycle, and I think our data was showing that we were pretty haphazard about that. We might shock once or twice in the first part of the cardiac arrest. There were times when 10 minutes would go by and the patient was in ventricular fibrillation. Why weren't they getting that shock every 2 minutes like clockwork? We weren't sure, but we wanted to start measuring that. And we wanted to minimize the peri-shock pause, or we know one of the major reasons that we stop chest compressions is to shock the patient. And if you're using an automatic defibrillator, one of the reasons is you're not supposed to touch the patient while it's in the analysis phase. So you have to have hands off while the computer analyzes the heart rhythm. And then it starts to charge the capacitor. And a lot of times that makes an audible noise, right? Right? Lets you know that the analysis is over. Now it's getting ready to shock the patient. Well, we can do chest compressions in most AEDs, okay? Not all, but most you can do chest compressions while the capacitor is charging. Because remember, when you stop chest compressions for any reason, coronary and cerebral perfusion pressures start to drop precipitously. And if it drops below 15 millimeters of mercury, odds are we're going to shock these patients into asystole, not into a perfusing rhythm. So it's actually kind of important that we minimize the interval between stopping compressions and shocking. And so if you go back in time to the 2005 guidelines and before, we would always say, okay, stop CPR, I'm clear, you're clear, Aunt Betty's clear, we're all clear. What time is it? Yes. Audio? Okay. Is it okay? Okay. You want me to try this? Okay. So now I'm going to walk around and drive the cameraman crazy. Okay. So we want to shock on a 2-minute cycle. That didn't always happen. And we want to minimize the peri-shock pause, or the pause around the shock. There's 2 ways we can do that. We can do chest compressions while the capacitor is charging and right up to the shock and minimize that pre-shock interval. And we can get right back on the chest without peaking after we shock. But a lot of times what people would do is we would say, okay, it's time to defibrillate, analyze the heart rhythm. We would stop and we would watch the AED, analyze the rhythm, and then we would listen to it charge up the capacitor, and then we would deliver the shock, and then we would stare at the heart rhythm to see what happened to it after the shock. All of that is completely unnecessary in 2016, especially if you are using waveform capnography, because the idea is when we have a sudden rise in end-tidal CO2, that's a very good indicator that we probably have a perfusing rhythm on the monitor. So minimizing that pre and post-shock pause turns out to be really important. And then we knew we wanted to identify acute STEMI early. So if these patients are in cardiac arrest because they're suffering a major heart attack, then we want to find that out. We want to alert our receiving hospital. We want to give them an opportunity, if clinically stable enough, to go directly to the cardiac cath lab for emergency angiography. And then finally, we want targeted temperature management. So we knew we had to work with the receiving hospital. This is why the multidisciplinary committee meetings at the hospital were so very important. Because if we do our part and we get a pulse back and we deliver the patient off to the hospital after we cross that threshold in the hospital door, we've done our part, but now it's up to them. But we have a vested interest in that too, right? Because we're the emergency services in our jurisdiction, and as patient advocates, we want to make sure that they have access to evidence-based therapy. For example, it would not be acceptable if, depending on what physician was on call, the patient would or would not receive evidence-based therapy. We were standardizing our approach to managing sudden cardiac arrest out in the field, and at this meeting we said, we want you to standardize your approach to post-resuscitation care up at the hospital. And there were a lot of hurdles to overcome to make all that happen, but it turned out to be one of the very most important things that we did, is establishing that meeting where we could bring our concerns and respectfully engage in dialogue with our colleagues in emergency medicine and cardiology, because we didn't always understand the pressures that they face, and they didn't always understand the pressures that we face. So we got to understand each other's world a little bit, and by getting to know one another, we were able to actually solve and navigate some of these problems. As they say in the Resuscitation Academy in Seattle, it isn't complicated, meaning no single piece of any of this is complicated, but it's not easy. It's like trying to pull stars into alignment or planets into alignment. And I think in most systems that have never really optimized care for sudden cardiac arrest, they occasionally saved someone, just like occasionally the planets are in alignment, okay? I'm not saying they accidentally saved someone, but there's that time you had a short response time, you found them in VFib, you shocked them right away, everyone's favorite ER physician was on duty, the post-resuscitation care was fantastic, and the patient woke up, everyone feels like $1 million and remembers why they got into emergency services in the first place. So that can happen almost accidentally. The question is, can we make these planets come into alignment every time? Is there a way to make that happen? It's not easy. That part is not easy. So, changing a culture. We started with a quote by Peter Pronovost from Johns Hopkins. He's part of their patient safety department, and he's fond of saying, every system is perfectly designed to achieve the results that it gets. So if you're in a system that saves 0 people from sudden cardiac arrest, he would argue your system is perfectly designed to save 0 people from sudden cardiac arrest. So you can contrast that against some of the better functioning systems in the United States. So one of the first things that we did is map out all the different things that happen during sudden cardiac arrest. And so this is basically the CARES registry in a linear graph. So I want to show you that even though we report our response times on Hilton Head Island as 5 minutes, and you might think, wow, 5 minutes, that's fantastic. If you actually look at from the time of collapse, it usually takes a minute for bystanders to realize that there's an emergency, that someone has collapsed, and it's not just a fainting, that there's a bad problem. It takes them about a minute to find a telephone and make the 911 call. Call processing usually takes 1 minute to 90 seconds before the tones drop at our fire station, that we're alerted to the fact that there's an emergency. Then we have a reaction time. We have to stop whatever we're doing. If we're in the middle of training, we have to run to the apparatus. We have to start it. We have to break the plane of the bay doors as we go en route, and we announce to our dispatcher, we're en route to this emergency, okay? And then what I call wheels up. So in other words, we've just left the fire station to wheels down at the curb side of the emergency. You can see how far out we are now from the time of collapse. This patient's been laying now on the ground for several minutes. Hence the importance of telecommunicator CPR. Our dispatchers should be tuned into the fact that this is a cardiac arrest on the other end of this telephone and doing whatever they can to help facilitate bystander CPR, because that's going to buy us a little time. It needs to buy us a little time, or else we're going to arrive too late for this patient to have a positive prognosis. One of the things that we'll talk about a little bit later, because you'll also, up here you see it says public access defibrillation, social media citizen responders. So this is an app called Pulse Point in the United States. We don't have it yet in my jurisdiction. But overall in the United States, AED use is incredibly low. In my community, it's less than 8%. I think last year, all the national data from the CARES registry, it was less than 3%. So we have a lot of AEDs out there in the community, and they are not being used. And the reasons are complicated. But we know there are areas in the world, like for example, the Netherlands, where they are successful 60+% of the time getting an AED to the patient's side, even in the patient's home, and most cardiac arrests happen in the patient's home. So we know it's possible. We just haven't used our imagination enough. So the way they've done that in the Netherlands, for example, is they have neighborhood block captains, and the dispatchers contact the neighborhood block captain. They put on their reflective vest, they grab the AED, and they rush over to the neighbor's house with the AED. So creative solutions like that, if you think about it, if you imagine You know, what if it was a member of your family that was going to do, and you somehow knew that they were going to experience sudden cardiac arrest in your community in the next 365 days, and it was your job to figure out how to save their life based on what was politically possible today? What could you do? What changes could you make? How would you think of it differently? I would think of it differently because it hits home when it's one of your own. So, okay. So we decided to enhance the way that we approached sudden cardiac arrest, and we call this approach pit crew CPR, pit crew training. Some places call it a choreographed model. That's what it's referred to in the AHA ECC guidelines. In Seattle, they refer to it as high performance CPR. I live in the Southeast. There's a lot of people that like to watch NASCAR. You have to know your audience. It's marketing. So we called ours pit crew, but it's like a Formula One pit crew is the idea, that when we go into a cardiac arrest, everyone knows what their job is. Okay, so we made it very clear what our process was. It was no longer going to be the case where it was up to an individual paramedic whether or not we worked this cardiac arrest on scene or whether or not we were going to work it on the way to the hospital. Our way was that we were going to work the cardiac arrest on scene. We were going to ensure that chest compressions were happening with the correct rate, depth, and recoil. We were going to make sure that we were shocking the patient on a 2-minute cycle and we were minimizing the perishock pause and that we were using capnography, etc. So one of the ways that we did that is we sent a supervisor to the scene with a checklist to make sure that all of our evidence-based benchmarks were being met. Because a lot of times, these calls can be chaotic. You might forget to hook up the waveform capnography. You might forget to hook up the oxygen. There's different ways that the thing can go off the rail. So we borrowed this from aviation, right? Aren't you happy when you fly on an airplane and you're coming in for a landing that the pilot has a landing checklist, right? Is everyone happy that their landing gear is down when they land at an airport? I'm happy. I'm happy they do a landing checklist before they land an airplane. And so this is the idea. If it's a really mission critical benchmark, we put it on a checklist so that someone's job was to read that checklist aloud and make sure that we were hitting all of our important benchmarks. So let's get to the question we came here for. Should we ventilate patients in cardiac arrest? Should we ventilate them? My answer is going to be yes. You might say it depends, but let's look at what our options are. And then we'll start with run-of-the-mill adult sudden cardiac arrest. We have 3 options right now. Number 1, we can perform conventional CPR with a compression ventilation ratio of 30:2, okay? So what everyone's pretty much familiar with. Up in Seattle, for example, Seattle Fire Department performs what is referred to as BLS continuous, meaning they perform continuous chest compressions at the appropriate rate, depth, and recoil, but on the upstroke of every 10th compression, they give a small breath, okay? Sometimes called upstroke ventilations. In Seattle, they refer to it as BLS continuous. And then you have the so-called cardio-cerebral resuscitation that came out of Arizona. And the concept is that at the moment of collapse, run-of-the-mill adult sudden cardiac arrest, your arterial system is full of fresh oxygenated blood. And that blood can be circulated with just chest compressions for a finite amount of time. And we're not entirely sure what the time is. Most people are in agreement that that time period is probably at least 6 minutes. After 6 minutes, there's no consensus. So for example, Peter Kudenchuk, who is the sort of the CPR Yoda in Seattle, that studies the science of CPR. He has a very interesting video on YouTube called The Science of CPR that you should probably watch. He argues that after 6 minutes, if we're not providing any ventilations whatsoever, that can cause atelectasis in the lungs, and that can actually impair blood return from pulmonary circulation that can lower cardiac output. So after that 6-minute mark, he feels like we do have to give positive pressure. Now keep in mind, in Seattle, they are experts at both 30:2 and BLS continuous. They are not hyperventilating. They are not squeezing the bag too hard. They are just bagging enough to keep the alveoli open. And I think most of the United States is probably not using the bag valve mask correctly. Having just come back from the Resuscitation Academy, I can tell you, in my system, we have not been using the bag valve mask correctly for two reasons. Number one, we've been squeezing the bag too hard and putting in too much tidal volume, even though we didn't think we were. Okay, that's number one. And number two, we were waiting too long in between compressions to give the two breaths. And so what I learned up in Seattle is that the rescuer on chest compressions needs to be completely divorced from the person that's giving the breaths. But what our nature to happen is if you're on chest compressions and you're doing 30, you might count out loud and say 25, 26, 27, 28, 29, 30. You stop compressions and what do? You stare at the guy whose job it is to give the breaths. And you watch and you wait and he gives his two breaths and maybe he took too long or maybe, who knows. But you wait till he's done and then you start your compressions again. Well, we found out by using CodeStat, which we'll talk more, I think Dr. Davies it sounded to me backstage like he was talking about CodeStat. We found out that sometimes we were delaying as long as 5, sometimes 6 seconds for these breaths to be given. If you're waiting that long, then I think your coronary perfusion pressure, your cerebral perfusion pressure is probably going all the way back down to 0. And you're starting back over at 0, and I think that's probably bad. And since most systems probably perform that way, it explains to me why so many systems have seen really great results with cardiocerebral resuscitation because they're just taking the ventilations out of it completely. So I would say, in my opinion, conventional CPR performed expertly is superior, in my humble opinion. The truth is we don't know. But superior to cardiocerebral resuscitation in my mind because, number one, it works on asphyxial arrest too. And I do worry that if we train everybody to omit ventilations and just put a non-rebreather mask and just do continuous chest compressions, what about a drowning? What about a hanging? What about an asthma attack? You have to be careful what you make your people experts in because that muscle memory takes over and they tend to do the same thing all the time. So I do like that at least with the conventional CPR, we're not omitting ventilations. All patients are going to receive ventilations, and some of those are going to be non-shockable events or asphyxial arrest. Here's an example. This is based on an animal model just to show that it takes about 15 chest compressions before our pressure starts to get good. So if you see here, the top waveform here is aortic systolic pressure. Okay, so this is actually what's perfusing the brain. And then it's harder to see, but this darker line is aortic diastolic pressure. And that's perfusing the heart because the coronary arteries perfuse during diastole. So you can think of it this way as you're performing chest compressions. On the downstroke, you're perfusing the brain. On the upstroke, you're perfusing the heart. So you can think of it as brain, heart, brain, heart, brain, heart. This is one of the reasons that full recoil is so important. If we don't allow full recoil, we're not achieving that slight negative pressure gradient on the upstroke of CPR that is bringing blood return back to the heart. That is one of the things about poor recoil that can really cause problems with cardiac arrest survival. It's another major finding for us when we got back from Seattle. So, but in defense of the people that believe in cardiocerebral resuscitation, here they are doing just continuous chest compressions with no pauses whatsoever, and you can see perfusion remains absolutely excellent, and even diastolic aortic pressure continues to climb even over here, and we're probably on about our 50th compression over there. So they do have a point, physiologically speaking, provided that there is no atelectasis. Again, these are theories. This has not been adequately studied, but we do know that the evidence was analyzed in this latest 2015 AHA-ECC guidelines, and they did make some statements. They basically said that it is acceptable in priority-based, multi-tiered response systems, whatever that means, to delay positive pressure ventilation by using a strategy of up to 3 cycles of 200 continuous compressions. Okay, so 3 times 200 is 600. They're saying it's okay to do it for 6 minutes. Now, Peter Kudenchuk in Seattle would say, we've already burned that 6 minutes because our telecommunicators got a bystander to push on the chest while you were en route, okay? So he feels that bystanders have already used up that 6 minutes by doing compression-only CPR while the professional rescuers were en route to the scene. So he would be against professional rescuers doing that, utilizing this strategy. And so they said, we do not recommend the routine use of passive ventilation techniques, but if your system uses bundles of care, again, what does that mean? There's some strange statements that aren't defined in the ECC guidelines. Involving continuous chest compressions, the use of passive ventilation techniques may be considered as part of that bundle. So reading between the lines here, I think they're just, they don't want anyone to think that this is the answer to everything. It's only for run-of-the-mill adult sudden cardiac arrest where someone has collapsed with their arterial system full of fresh oxygenated blood. And again, I think it's not controversial that you can definitely circulate that blood for at least 6 minutes. There's no really consensus beyond that. And I would say almost in any system, for example, even though we ventilate with 30 and 2, it takes a while to deploy your bag valve mask and hook it up to oxygen and make sure that your suction is functioning and put in an OPA. We do all that during the first 2-minute cycle after the first shock. So we really don't start doing 30 and 2 until after the second shock. So patient side to first shock is 1 minute, 2-minute cycle. After the first shock, we're at minute 3 before we start doing 30 and 2. Now you could say that that's a hybrid approach. It's really not. It's just that we weren't born with a bag valve mask in our hand. We have to retrieve these items from our bag. We have to build this airway circuit. We build ours during the first 2-minute cycle after the first shock. So here we are in Seattle at the Resuscitation Academy. This was just a few weeks ago. This is Seattle Fire Department Engine 2, and they are doing BLS continuous. So you can see that the rescuer on chest compressions is actually actively doing CPR, and I stopped this frame while the guy is actually squeezing the bag. So all they've done is put in an OPA, and they're doing continuous chest compressions, and they're doing these upstroke ventilations. So you might think to yourself, well, isn't that the best of both worlds? So we're not doing passive oxygen administration, but we're still getting our continuous chest compressions, but we're given that little puff of air to keep the alveoli inflated. This must be the answer to everything. This must be what we ought to be doing out in the field. Well, maybe not, because a paper just came out in November in the New England Journal of Medicine that showed absolutely no difference between so-called BLS continuous and conventional 30 and 2. So I guess what I want to emphasize to you is we don't know. There's so much we don't know. And a lot of things in resuscitation can easily lend themselves to what we call narrative bias. In medicine, we always want to explain things. Why did this happen? We'll say, well, I think because we're improving coronary perfusion pressure, and once it gets above 15 millimeters of mercury, that's why we're shocking this patient into a perfusing rhythm. It sounds good, but half of the time we make up stories like that, it turns out not to be true when we get the real evidence down the road. So just always be mindful when you're telling yourself why one thing works and why one thing, you might be walking it back in 5 years when we go through another update or another study gets published. Truth is we don't know, but these strategies are equivalent. Okay, so for example, in King County Medical One system right now, Seattle Fire is still using BLS continuous with upstroke ventilations, but King County EMS on the outskirts of King County that surround Seattle, they're switching to 30 and they're sticking with 30 and 2. So even within the Medic One system, arguably the best in the world, they're using more than one strategy for ventilating patients in cardiac arrest. So my vote is for conventional CPR at a ratio of 30 and 2 with caveats. Performed well. Performed well. But whatever you choose, conventional CPR with 30 and 2, cardiocerebral resuscitation, BLS continuous, be very good at it. Be an expert in it. Do it well. Measure your results, measure your outcomes, and prove that it's helping patients. I think if you do that, then it really doesn't matter. And also, but if you use cardiocerebral resuscitation, just make sure you understand it's not appropriate for children who have drowned. It's not appropriate for PEA. It's not appropriate for asystolic arrest. This is only for patients with run-of-the-mill adult sudden cardiac arrest. Okay. And remember that the rescuer on the chest compressions when doing 30 and 2 should pause for 2 seconds, 3 at the most, to allow time for the rescuer on the airway to give those 2 quick, small breaths with the bag valve mask. And remember, we're only looking for, in the Resuscitation Academy, they only want 300 to 400 milliliters. That's 2 very small bag squeezes. I encourage you to go out and try it on the mannequins out there. I guess according to the guidelines, they told me yesterday, they say 300 to 600. Even so, we're talking about a very small bag squeeze. And we want to squeeze, release, because remember, when the air goes in, it increases interthoracic pressure. So we want to prevent atelectasis, but we don't want to keep the bag squeezed. We want to squeeze and fully release, squeeze and fully release. But that person on chest compressions, after they've waited 2-3 seconds tops, should be getting right back on chest compressions. And I have a hunch, and again, I don't know, that if they ever randomized 30 and 2 versus cardiocerebral resuscitation, and the 30 and 2 were done right, I'd be surprised if there was a survival benefit. There might be a subset that do better with cardiocerebral. I don't know. It's the study everyone's calling for in light of this most recent paper in the New England Journal of Medicine. Okay, let's talk about simulation a little bit, because you've already seen how we simulate what we're calling pit crew CPR with our EMTs and paramedics, which, by the way, is a BLS event. The emphasis is on expertly performed basic life support. That is the key. We know the evidence-based therapies. It is chest compressions and it is defibrillation. Those are the most important therapies. So doing things like advanced airway procedures right during the middle of the sweet spot of the code, we discourage that. If someone's going to start putting a laryngoscope in the patient's mouth, we don't want them to stop chest compressions to do that. And if they have perfectly good compliance with the bag valve mask and they're not having any problems, my question to them would be, why? Why are you entering risk into the situation right now and we don't even know if it's going to benefit? But we do know we might have to interrupt chest compressions. Now they know in my system that we're watching with CodeStat, I can tell when they stop chest compressions. So I'll know if they stop compressions for 30 seconds to intubate. And you know what? My guys don't stop compressions to intubate on the first attempt, okay? But what happens to us? Is there anyone in the room that has no ego whatsoever? None, okay? Aren't you mad at yourself when you can't perform a clinical procedure? I mean, they're like, man, I saw the epiglottis, I was right in there, I almost saw my landmark. One more second and I would have had it. They want another shot at it. And it's usually the second attempt where they are asking someone to stop compressions. And they always end up stopping longer than they thought. Because when we do our post-event critique, and they'll go, well, I only stopped compressions for a few seconds. A few seconds? Okay. When you measure, it's maybe 20 seconds. Okay. So what you feel in your heart happened on the call, okay, is not always what actually happened on the call according to the data. So high fidelity simulation is extremely important for team dynamics and team performance. But we took it the next step. We actually resuscitated a mannequin, went through our post-resuscitation care checklist, which includes pulse oximetry, a full set of vital signs, a temperature, a 12-lead ECG, and then basically we take a look at what we have. We gingerly bring up the SpO2. We try not to blow off all their end-tidal CO2. If the 12-lead ECG shows acute STEMI, we announce code STEMI and make sure we take this patient to a PCI hospital so they have a chance of going to the cardiac cath lab. And if they're a candidate for our code ICE protocol, we will cool them if they are not following commands according to our checklist. So we actually simulated this and we brought this mannequin right into the emergency department. And actually this turned out to be very beneficial because they found a lot of flaws with their program. For example, when they have a machine right here, and this is how they cool patients down. It's called the GAMAR machine. There's another one called the Arctic Sun, and basically this pumps cold fluid around the patient's thorax and legs and it starts to lower their body temperature. Well, when they moved the patient up to the cardiac cath lab, they forgot to plug it back in. Okay? So the patient in this simulated procedure was in the cardiac cath lab, and the temperature started to drop and no one noticed because it wasn't plugged in upstairs. So if you do simulations, it helps you find problems with your thought process at a time that it's not hurting anybody. You're better off finding these problems during simulations than you would be on an actual patient, because you might have a bad outcome that you didn't intend for. But what we really want to do, in addition to cooling them, if they're showing STEMI, is if they're in cardiac arrest, or if they were in cardiac arrest because they were suffering a massive heart attack and had an occluded artery, like for example in this case, we have a patient with a huge lesion in their left anterior descending artery, we want to get that stented. We want to reperfuse that heart so that this patient can start to stabilize. And so this is, post-resuscitation care is difficult. Saving patients' lives are difficult. A lot of times they have to be cooled. They go to the cath lab. Sometimes they require a 5-vessel bypass. Sometimes they need an implantable cardioverter defibrillator. And sometimes they need extensive psychological counseling because a lot of them suffer depression after all this is over. So it's a long, hard road to recovery for many of these. Not all, but many of these patients are very, very sick, and learning how to save their life is a process. So let's talk about quality improvement and feedback, because we do have the ability now to use this program called CodeStat, and you can think of it almost like Big Brother watching now when you're working cardiac arrest, because it has an impedance channel that records chest compressions and things like that. I can see how often they're shocking the patients, and it gives me great insight into what is actually happening on a cardiac arrest. I can do things like this one's labeled time to first shock. And if I look at the timestamps here, the first shock was delivered at 2 minutes and 57 seconds after reaching the patient's side. That's not quite up to our expectations. When we first started pit crew CPR, we decided that we wanted our patients to receive the first shock within 60 seconds of arriving at the patient's side. But before that, we benchmarked the entire department. We brought every single crew in, and we didn't tell them what we were doing. We just gave them the scenario and we videotaped them. And what we were looking for is to see how far into the scenario before they delivered a shock to a patient in ventricular fibrillation. Our top performer, one, was 48 seconds. Our slowest case was almost 5 minutes. But it was all over the place. And when we asked, well, why did it take so long to shock the patient? We heard things like, I thought we were supposed to do 2 minutes of CPR first. Okay, but 5 minutes? Did you do it twice? You just kind of ask why. Well, because we didn't ever tell them, we didn't ever have that expectation before, and we certainly didn't train it. And some people didn't believe it was possible. They didn't think it could be done in 60 seconds. And so we started training until everybody could get that accomplished within 60 seconds. So that's phase 1 of our pit crew CPR process. We have another one here where we're looking at perishock pauses. Now there's 2 problems here that I see on this particular cardiac arrest. Number 1, it's a professional paramedic with a LifePak 12, which is a completely manual cardiac monitor that has been placed into AED mode for reasons that aren't completely clear to me. I guess he wanted to free up some hands. So he's allowing the computer to decide whether or not the patient needs to be shocked. And during those intervals, he has absolutely no CPR happening at all. So you can see that second pause, that second shock. There's about a 30-second perishock pause. And again, that's kind of against our expectations. So that kind of looks bad. There's 4 really long pauses on this CodeStat report, but wouldn't you know it, the patient lived, right? So sometimes they survive in spite of us, when we make errors, But if your system is deep enough, if you're doing enough other things right, you can make 1 or 2 mistakes in certain areas, and your patient may still have a chance at survival. And here's an example where, up at the top, the green waveform is showing post-shock compressions. This was associated with a sudden rise in end-tidal CO2. And so if we have a sudden rise in end-tidal CO2 after a shock, and a lot of times you can kind of see through the CPR artifact to tell that you have a perfusing or a organized looking rhythm under the monitor, we will stop and do a pulse check. But the green waveform that continues on, that is how fast the rescuer is bagging the patient right now, okay? So these breaths are going in about a little faster than every 2.5 seconds, right? We're supposed to be waiting at least every 6 seconds. So this patient is what? Is being hyperventilated, okay? So we're blowing off this patient's CO2. This is not good for them. We're lowering their blood pressure. We are way, way, way over bagging. So this is a real problem, and if you don't measure it and don't give the feedback, you may never know that. So what's next? What's next in my system? Well, as I mentioned, we just recently went all the way to the other corner of the United States, to Seattle, King County, and attended the Resuscitation Academy there, where we learned a lot of interesting things. One of the most important things that we learned was the importance of our dispatchers. I think we undervalued the extreme importance of our telecommunicators that are responsible for the call intake process for sudden cardiac arrest. I have listened to those tapes before when patients have experienced sudden cardiac arrest. They're very difficult tapes for me to listen to sometimes because as a paramedic, it seems obvious to me that there's a cardiac arrest on the other end of the telephone. And so you feel very helpless listening to the tape as this victim is trying to get across to the dispatcher that something's very, very wrong and bystander CPR instructions are not being given. And so what they teach in the Resuscitation Academy is this can all be very, very simple. After confirming the location of the cardiac arrest, and we have a callback number if we need to get a hold of the person, and we confirm it's a medical emergency and not a fire or a police emergency, they ask two very simple questions. Is the patient conscious? If the answer is no, they ask, is the patient breathing normally? Any deviation from yes, and they initiate immediate bystander CPR instructions, okay? Because agonal gasps fool bystanders and dispatchers and sometimes even professional rescuers. Ironically, agonal gasps are a really good sign. It suggests that you have a patient whose brain is still just perfused enough to where they're having agonal gasps. These are patients who desperately need bystander CPR, but a lot of times they don't receive that. So that is all that's really required in the King County system. They've been doing it for a long time. They've never injured anybody that received chest compressions that turned out not to be experiencing sudden cardiac arrest, and they almost always catch sudden cardiac arrest, and it only takes them a minute or two before they have compressions happening. And that bends the curve, right? Because you know survival decreases 10 minutes, or 10% for every minute from the moment of collapse. It takes us about 10 minutes to get to the scene on a good day before we're getting in there and providing high-quality CPR. By them having these bystanders push on the chest, it bends that. It turns that line into a curve. It buys us time to get there and implement high-performance CPR. Because once we implement high-performance CPR, we can stop that curve from going down. We can prolong that time. We know now patients can survive up to an hour, maybe even more, in cardiac arrest, and as long as we are perfusing their brain well, they can still have complete neurological outcome. We perfuse patients so well with high-performance CPR, we have had patients wake up, we have had patients move their legs, and all sorts of things that we never saw before when we weren't doing nearly as good a job with CPR as we do today. I will say this about AEDs in the United States. There's tremendous opportunity for improvement. This is the Utstein Survival Report for last year. As you can see, less than 3% bystander AED use. On Hilton Head Island, that number is slightly higher, but only about 8.1%. We need to do better. We've invested way too much money on these life-saving devices. We have them out in the community. These are things that we have to unite the AED with a bystander who is ready, willing, and able to act. And one of the ways that we could potentially do that is to find out the location of all these AEDs. So we've started an online AED registry to where we find AEDs in our community that we didn't know about. We start to map them on our dispatcher's map so that they can see that there's an AED nearby. We've placed them in law enforcement and security vehicles in our gated communities, but we still have to address how these folks know that there's a sudden cardiac arrest in their vicinity. They're not listening to our dispatch radio, so we need to create a mechanism so that they can actually use. It's not enough to put these in a policeman's trunk. They need to actually be dispatched to the call. And one of the things that we're looking at is the Pulse Point app. So this is social media based This turns people into citizen rescuers, whether CPR or AED, okay? But this still has to be attached to dispatch. They still have to enter it into their CAD system as sudden cardiac arrest. I'll give you a kind of a powerful example. This map is from Alameda County, California, a very populous county in California. I don't know how well you can see it, but there are little red crosses on this map, and those represent fire stations. So this is where the fire stations are in Alameda County. So presumably, if you call 911, you're going to be getting an ambulance or help from one of these fire stations. Now I'm going to show you all the citizen responders at a given point in time that were standing by in Alameda County, just waiting for a push notification on their telephone that their help was needed. So here's the map with the fire stations. Here's the map with all the people that have downloaded the Pulse Point app standing by for a push notification. This could potentially be a game changer. It's still early for Pulse Point. They're still collecting survivor stories, but it just seems intuitive that this makes sense. It's a new world. Everyone's carrying around a GPS unit in their pocket. Isn't it crazy to think that someone could be dying right now in the other room? We have that AED there on the wall. No one knows it's there. We know it's there, but we don't know that there's a cardiac arrest in the other room. Wouldn't it be great if we got a push notification to let us know that, and then we could just grab that AED and go help? That is the problem that Pulse Point is trying to solve. So currently on Hilton Head Island, this is our complete data set for 5.5 years, just to show you our ups and downs. So in 2010, we started reporting to the CARES registry about halfway through the year. We had not optimized our system performance yet. And so for the second half of 2010, that 6 months, we saved 0 people, okay? So this is the best data we have to say we just weren't saving anyone in sudden cardiac arrest prior to joining the CARES registry. Anecdotally, it seems like maybe we saved 1 patient a year previous to that, but I don't think 2. I think if we were lucky, we saved about 1 patient a year. The next year, we saved 4 patients that otherwise would have died, additional patients. So we actually saved a total of 5. And then our miracle year, 2012, we saved 9 additional patients. So we saved a total of 10 patients in 2012, and that's the year that we received our Heart Safe Community Award. So what do you think we did? Double our efforts? Train twice as hard? No, we didn't. We declared victory. We thought we had this thing figured out, and we can devote our attention to other things like fire suppression and hazmat and urban search and rescue. Life doesn't work that way. Once you achieve a gain, you will lose it if you don't maintenance it. So it was followed by 2 years of very mediocre performance, during which time we fell back into some bad habits. We weren't using the checklist. Some of our cardiac arrests were being worked on scene or on the way to the hospital again. The wheels were coming off the wagon. So we had to retrain the entire department over again. And now in 2015, we're back up to 50%. But still, for all cases, for the full 5.5 years, our survival rate for witnessed, so someone witnessed the collapse in the initial shockable rhythm, is 42%, which is well above the national average. And so that's how we're doing right now on Hilton Head Island. We're hoping to make that even better. And let's remember, though, why we're doing this, because I think this is probably the most important part of all. It's for this guy, okay? It's for this guy. This gentleman's name is Tim Sufal. He's from St. Louis, Missouri, and he was on vacation with his wife on Hilton Head Island. He started having chest pain, and she tried to drive him to the hospital. That's my wife, Kelly, on the left, by the way. She's an acute care nurse practitioner, and she's the chair of our resuscitation steering committee at the hospital. So he suffered cardiac arrest in the car, and they were lost because the GPS had them all up behind the mall, and they couldn't get out. So he's in cardiac arrest, and she was driving him around, hysterical, contacted 911. Our dispatcher had the sense to say, stop moving, pull over. You're a moving target right now. This is bad. Fortunately, they were very close to our fire station. We implemented pit crew CPR. We got his pulse back, but he was not obeying commands, okay? And his 12-lead ECG showed unequivocal acute anterior STEMI. So he was both a code STEMI and a code ICE went to the hospital. 2 days later, was rewarmed, was taken out of his medically induced coma, and he woke up neurologically intact with a CPC score of 1, like perfectly intact. And I love this photo because to me it looks almost like he has almost a white glow, almost like an angel. So I love this picture too because my wife's in it. But you know, earlier, remember I was telling you the importance of the multidisciplinary steering committee? It's because we need to find champions, right? We need other people. We need allies who believe that this can work, because for any change that you want to make, there's someone else who say, it's impossible. We can't do it, right? So by going to nursing and emergency medicine and cardiology and finding those clinical champions who agree with you and say, yes, this is important, we can do it, we will do it, because you're going to find those champions, but you're going to have someone else. You're going to have what I call the anti-champions, people that might even sabotage, they just don't want change. Well, guess what? Survivors silence the anti-champions, okay? Once you start having real survivors, real people that were returning to their families, it makes a huge, huge difference in sudden cardiac arrest survival. Again, I can't tell you how honored I am to be here, and I hope all of us in the United States and Mexico can work together to move the needle on sudden cardiac arrest and promote survival in both countries. Thank you so much.
Bien, nos comentaba dentro de la conferencia que para poder ustedes iniciar con el plan que hicieron, tuvieron que haber tenido una reunión, todos los equipos, todos los que estaban involucrados, farmacia, técnicos en urgencias médicas, bomberos, pero ¿cuánto tiempo les tomó a ustedes tener que reunir a todas estas personas? Porque dijo algo muy importante, no podíamos empezar si solo uno faltaba. Entonces creo que una de las problemáticas que nosotros tenemos es de que a veces nuestro ego es tan grande que como institución no podemos tener esa coordinación. ¿Cuánto tiempo les tomó a ustedes hacer la vinculación y el poder reunir a todas esas personas?
It's an interesting question because initially the hospital was very interested in improving their door-to-balloon times for acute STEMI. So in the United States, the CMS that controls Medicare is very powerful, and they control how much money the hospital makes. And they were under tremendous pressure to have their patients who were suffering a heart attack be sent to the cath lab in a certain amount of time so that they could prove that they were performing well, and then they would make more money. And so they initially came to us for our help to help facilitate that. So we were doing 12 lead ECGs out in the field, and we were giving them early notification that this patient was going to be showing up at their hospital with an acute STEMI, and it really streamlined their care all the way to the cardiac cath lab. And so going through that process, it helped us develop these relationships with the cardiac cath lab manager, the cardiologist, to a lesser extent, the emergency physicians. But that was really the first time. It was clumsy, but at least we could put a face with the name. I knew who these people were at that point in time. And as things started to do better with STEMI, we were able to use it as a template for sudden cardiac arrest. And I think we performed much better in the second meeting when we transferred over from heart attack, just mere heart attack care, over to sudden cardiac arrest. It was far more successful at that point. So initially they did come to us because they needed something, okay? But I would say prior to that, if you want to get your foot in the door, I would say get the support of your own organization, because at least the way it works on Hilton Head Island, we're with the fire department, the municipal fire department, so we work for the city, and our hospital is the largest employer in town, and I feel like if the fire chief ever had to call the CEO of the hospital and say, hey, may I have a conversation with you about how we together save patients' lives in our community, I think a CEO of a hospital would be crazy not to take a phone call politically like that from the fire chief. So maybe it has to start at that level to get buy-in from the very top person at the hospital, from the very top person at your organization. That might help facilitate lower level meetings in the hospital if they know that the top boss is on board.
¿Alguna otra pregunta? ¿Alguien más? Sí, perfecto. ¿Me ayudas?
Sí, buenas tardes. Estuvo hablando sobre la ventilación pasiva, la oxigenación en este caso. ¿Ha tenido alguna experiencia con algún protocolo de investigación en este sentido sobre qué pacientes son los candidatos ideales? Y en este caso, ¿qué dispositivos, si las puntas nasales, altos flujos, alguna mascarilla o cómo se debe realizar esta oxigenación pasiva? ¿Tienen alguna experiencia en este caso en su localidad?
So there's different philosophies. There's different philosophies on how this should be achieved. I think most systems just place a non-rebreather mask at about 15 liters per minute, just so the FiO2 is 100%. But I've also heard of systems that put high-flow nasal cannula, and in addition to that, also a non-rebreather mask. But I think it's also important to remember that we want to maximize airway dimensions. So it helps, I think, let's say for an obese patient, we want to ramp them up a little bit, put the ear on the same level as the sternal notch with the face plane parallel to the ceiling. If necessary, you could put nasopharyngeal airways in each nostril, plus an oropharyngeal airway. I think I would make it as easy as possible for that passive oxygen to make it all the way into the patient's lungs.
¿Una más? Acá, por favor. Vamos de este lado y después aquí.
En su experiencia, usted comentaba que esto es un programa prácticamente amplio, que tiene que ver con difusión, que tiene que ver con una preparación por parte de todos los equipos, bomberos, ambulancias, supongo que hasta policía. Y la pregunta es, respecto a las cifras y al costo-beneficio, tanto de la respuesta de la sociedad, así como de todo esto que implica hacer la difusión, ¿cuáles fueron sus observaciones más importantes al enfrentarse, pues supongo que también a una sociedad renuente a participar en estos programas?
Well, it can be a problem. For example, the security forces on Hilton Head Island were very, very receptive to having automatic external defibrillators placed in the trunks of their patrol vehicles. But the county police, the county sheriff said, you know, over my dead body. We're police officers, we're not medical people, that's your job. You do your job and we'll do our job. So sometimes you hit roadblocks like that. So I think my suggestion would be change the things that you can change and then expand from there. Because even within my own organization, when we started with Pit Crew CPR, there were older paramedics that had been on the force for a very, very long time, and I don't think they really believed that it was going to work. So when they were initially, I was showing them the evidence, we're going to do this Pit Crew CPR, our performance is going to be better, and we're going to start saving people with cardiac arrest. I think they were skeptical. I don't think they believed it. But once they found out that we had fire stations coming by, patients coming to the fire station to say, hey, thank you for saving our life and things like that, that started to get their attention. And I feel very strongly that everyone that is involved in saving a patient's life, from the emergency dispatchers, first responders, EMTs, paramedics, it's important to recognize that. We have to celebrate our victories. It happens too infrequently, and how often do any of us really get told, hey, you've done a really good job, you know? So we need positive reinforcement, and I think sometimes people get caught up in the enthusiasm. Once they see it really is starting to work, we reach what I call the tipping point, okay? So you don't have to argue whether or not we ought to be doing these things anymore. That argument gets won, and instead of saying, should we do it, it's how are we going to do it? And that's a different, that's a change. It's a change in the conversation. People start to believe, and then they become advocates. And so the more people that are out there speaking to these, maybe as friends with a police officer and as telling them how awesome it is to save someone's life. And now that person whose brain was closed and said, no, it's not a law enforcement job, they start to imagine saving a person's life, and it feels kind of good, you know? So we need to celebrate our success, and because it is very important. What more awesome thing could we do than return someone back to their family? Anything? Yeah.
Tenemos tiempo para una última pregunta. Por acá había levantado la mano.
Oh. Buenos días. Felicidades por su ponencia. Considero, al igual que usted, que no en todas las situaciones, en algunas situaciones, el dar ciclos, compresiones, ventilaciones, puede ser, las ventilaciones pueden ser un motivo distractor e incluso hasta peligroso. El ejemplo del caso del paciente que tiene estómago lleno. Sobre todo quiero preguntar, nosotros aquí en México, bueno, en los hospitales en los que he estado, tenemos pacientes de trauma que acaban de comer y por alguna situación tuvieron un paro cardiorrespiratorio, o el paciente coronario que tuvo el paro cardiorrespiratorio y acaba de comer, estómago lleno, y entonces se enfocan mucho a las ventilaciones, y en las ventilaciones mismas es donde tienen el incidente de la broncoaspiración. No sé qué tan frecuente sea en el prehospitalario y qué hacen ante esas situaciones, porque es importante lo que usted menciona, comprimir perfusión cerebral, y bueno, ya la ventilación puede ser pasiva por ese mismo mecanismo.
Well, I agree in part. I think one of the reasons that we have problems with patient that has a full stomach is our air is going into the stomach and it's not going into the lungs. And part of that is because we're not positioning the patient's airway correctly, and I think we're also squeezing the bag too hard and maybe with too much force. And I think sometimes we end up putting too much air inside the stomach, which is already distended. There are systems, our system does not do this, but there are systems that would just put down an NG tube or a gastric tube and decompress the patient's stomach and just empty the stomach contents out during the resuscitation, maybe to help prevent that. But the truth of the matter is, sometimes patients vomit during a resuscitation. No one likes the fact that they vomit during a resuscitation. It's not going to be as pleasant a resuscitation once they start vomiting, but this is why we have suction units too. So even though I encourage people, don't intubate the patient unless you really have to. I think if you're starting to have airway compromise and you're having difficulty with the airway, the benefit of intubation moves up a little bit. I think if everything's working fine with basic maneuvers and you have good compliance and the patient's not vomiting, stick with it. It's working just fine, so there's no need to instrument the trachea at all. But if you're having a problem with the airway, the patient's starting to vomit and things like that, I think the case is a little bit stronger to go a little bit more invasive with your airway maneuvers, or at least it seems that way to me.